Next, we're going to have Chris Roberts. Chris will talk about some practical business and tax and other trade implications of Brexit, and hopefully give you some advice or some assistance that you may need.
So good morning, everybody. I don't know, I'm just depressed, I think is my personal view. So I'm from the north of England originally, so I lived in a place called Hull, which was very much Brexit territory. The conversation this morning around the politics and why we got there was really interesting because, as a UK firm for KPMG, if you spoke to our partners in London, there was absolutely no way this was going to happen. But if you spoke to our partners in the regional practices, like I was, driving 60 miles each day from Leeds to Hull, I never once saw a Remain sign. Everything was Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. So when it came, it was depressing, and it was a shock for me because I got woken up at 6:45 in the morning, turned on my phone, looked at the news, and then immediately got a phone call from a client that was making an acquisition and trying to raise €3 billion to buy a business in the UK. And the question was, what do we do? Because by that point, sterling had tanked. So there's some immediate issues, and I guess the immediate issues following the vote were really around Treasury. How do companies manage their exposure to volatility in the pound? Before we got some certainty around, what the process was going to be and what was going to happen. So this morning I'm going to talk about, the corporate view, I guess in particular this is focused on, a no deal, but points the direction in some way towards where we might end up with the EU, hopefully at the end of 2020, most likely, further on from the end of 2020 if we actually do exit this year. So the slide up on the page at the moment, it talks about what the exposure analysis is for businesses, and this is from the perspective of a no deal over on the right hand side to as an acceptable deal and successful negotiation over on the left hand side. But this is after we've gone through that what does the future look like negotiation, which can only happen once we've formally left the EU. So there's been a lot of discussion, and I think as a whole for our clients, some are really well prepared. They've been looking at this since the referendum because they've got regulatory issues. So if I look at both the disruption, market access, legal, and tariffs, so the pharmaceuticals industry has been right at the forefront of looking at what's the impact on their business, principally because a lot of them tended to license medicines in the UK. If you're licensing medicines in the UK with the UK regulator, that means they could be sold all across Europe. What would happen post-Brexit, what would happen in a hard Brexit, is you might not be able to sell that medicine in other EU member states if it was manufactured and licensed in the UK. So what does that mean? It means moving people, moving functions, perhaps duplicating, having something in the UK for UK distribution, something in the EU for EU distribution. The other industry that's been, that I guess initially took a very quick look at what they would need to do is financial services. So passporting rights, will I be able to still sell my financial products within the EU post-Brexit and vice versa? So we've seen a number of jobs move from London to the European Union. There's been a bit of a bidding war, a fight between Dublin, Frankfurt, Paris. Italy's been putting its hand up, although I don't think very many people want to go to Italy because the environment's a bit aggressive there occasionally from a tax perspective, and also Amsterdam. So the European medicines regulator ended up in Amsterdam. A number of jobs have gone to Dublin from the big US banks in particular, and then others split between Frankfurt and Paris. I think the reasons people aren't going to Paris are the tax regime. It's quite a high tax environment. People don't want to go there because of that. And I think Frankfurt it's Frankfurt, and it doesn't have the same draw as London. So, it's been, I think, difficult conversations have been had within business around who do we move and how. The businesses that were perhaps slower to the mark are, traditional manufacturers. Automotive was a bit slow, but we've seen that speed up, particularly in the last 12 months or so. So if you look at, tax and tariffs, if we end up with a cliff edge or a mitigated no deal and we revert to World Trade Organization regime, where do you get your car parts come from? Sometimes car parts will cross the border 2 or 3 times before they end up in a finished car. Will you have tariffs on each of those moves? If there's a queue at Dover of 45 miles from London of traffic, how do you get your goods across to meet just-in-time rules? You'd have the same. We've talked a lot about the disruption on the UK side. There'll be disruption on the continent as well. The French in particular are not shy about causing delays at the border in Calais. If anybody's gone on summer holidays to France, like I have, and the Netherlands as well is another area which is a key port into the UK. So how do businesses manage that supply chain? How do they deal with that disruption? So from an automotive perspective, I had conversations with clients around, do you move to a different port? Do you start stock building in the UK? How do you manage that risk to make sure you can meet your customers' demands? From a pharmaceutical perspective, what if your medicine has a short shelf life? It needs to stay refrigerated. It lasts 2 days once you've made it. Can you actually get it into the UK? The NHS has had conversations with a number of their suppliers or the key suppliers they brought into a room and basically said, if you can't provide us with the medicines, then it's your problem. It's not our problem, and it'd be your fault if people die because of that. It won't be ours. So very clearly putting the onus back on business, which I think came as quite a shock, particularly to some of my clients that were in the room. So clients have been stock building, so moving from maybe 2 months worth of stock to 9 months in one example. So the working capital cost, the funding cost of doing that is absolutely enormous. And I think from a UK economy perspective, that's probably quite good because it means that people are spending money, producing things, manufacturing things, and they're ready for an exit from the European Union. So it's probably kept the economy going. But we're probably going to have a number of those as we decide we're going to leave, and then we agree a timetable again, and then we decide we're going to leave again. So I think at some point it will come to a head. The fourth one on the slide there is the people slide. The people consequences. So, cliff edge, restricted migration, UK less favourable. I've seen a number of clients have real problems with this already, not because there are any rules in place that say an EU national can't come and work in the UK, but simply the value of the pound's dropped 20% against the euro since the vote. So particularly in the manufacturing north, in the food industry, in the agricultural industry, it relies very heavily on EU migrants coming in and working. So, they haven't come back to the UK after Christmas. They've gone and got jobs in Germany or France or elsewhere because the pound's just worth a lot less. And also, they don't feel welcome. If you're reading in the newspaper all the time around, negative stories around immigrants into the UK, stealing our jobs, etc., it's just not a welcoming environment to be in. So we've been helping a number of our clients with the messaging they can give to employees. So, we do love you. We want you to stay here. This is what you need to do to get registered to be able to stay here post-Brexit. To kind of help them put their mind at ease around that. Now, we haven't seen many clients completely underwrite, the risk of employees leaving, so paying for, full citizenship, in the UK. But we have seen, a number of clients looking to, facilitate, make things easier for their employees to stay. And when you're in a financial services industry and everybody's well paid, companies are willing to pay, a lot of money to get certainty for their employee base. When you're in food manufacturing and you've got 9,000 people, cutting up pork in a factory in East Yorkshire, the cost of doing that on an individual basis is absolutely enormous and prohibitive. But you need those people to stay because you can't get locals to do those jobs. So that that is a huge issue, and what the future looks like is a huge issue for those industries as well. So when we look at food manufacturing in particular, the salaries tend to be low. Agricultural salaries tend to be quite low. If you look at the proposed immigration rules that the government's talking about bringing in, well, they're looking at a floor on annual earnings, which is a relatively high number. They're looking at treating EU nationals exactly the same as nationals from outside of the EU. So, to look at some of the reasons for the vote, people stealing our jobs, coming to the UK from, the EU and stealing our jobs, but equally coming to the UK from outside of the EU and stealing our jobs. The irony is that we'll probably end up with more non-EU migrants to the UK than we had before. And then the last one is is an interesting one, particularly because it comes out of what happens in terms of an exit deal. So if your financial system is based on having to charge VAT at a certain rate, dealing with tariffs at a certain rate, treating exports to the EU as different to exports from outside the EU, being able to switch in the event of a no deal, or even being able to switch longer term, depending on where we end up, to change your IT system to align to a new set of regulations and rules is something that takes a very long time to do. We've had a 2-year period that we've gone past. A lot of businesses would struggle to change their IT system within a 2-year period, given some of the IT projects that I've been involved with. Charles talked briefly about the proposed unilateral measures in the event of a no deal. And so we've got the intention is to slash tariffs in the event of a no deal to 0% on most goods, with about 13% still being subjected to tariffs. So beef, lamb, pork and poultry and some dairy products in order to protect UK farmers from cheap imports. A number of tariffs on finished vehicles to protect the automotive sector. And then we've also got ceramics, fertiliser and fuel, where tariffs protect UK producers against unfair practices like dumping, etc. And then also goods like bananas, cane sugar and certain types of fish, where the UK has tariffs to give preferential access to developing countries. So, I think it's good that we won't end up with tariffs on a lot of products. From a UK perspective going forward, and our ability to negotiate trade deals, if we're willing to give all of this away, even if it's only for a temporary time, what does it mean for our trade negotiation strategy going forward? Because we've already, let ourselves down and given the house away by saying that we're willing to get rid of the tariffs to protect our economy. And if it doesn't have that big of an impact, then going into negotiation with the US, where agriculture in particular is an area where the UK would want to protect both UK farmers but also UK consumers. So we talked about chlorinated chicken. That is a huge issue in the UK. Whether it's right or wrong, it's a massive problem in the press in particular. The fact that that we potentially get chlorinated chicken in the UK. We prefer our own cows to be mad and protect our farmers from hormonal beef and that type of thing than let products that we consider to potentially be unsafe. The UK Republic of Ireland border, so what the government has said is there'll be no new checks at that border, and tariffs will be payable on goods moving from the EU into the rest of the UK via Northern Ireland. Now, how in practice that will be policed is quite controversial. Number one, the EU say that it would be illegal. 2, under the Good Friday Agreement, there can be no physical infrastructure on the border. So how do we maintain the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement and protect the single market for the EU? So I've talked briefly about sectors that are impacted. Every sector is impacted by the industry, by our leaving of the EU, but in different ways. So if you look at customs and duties, it's aerospace and defence, it's automotive that are impacted the most, and that's because they rely on heavily integrated cross-EU supply chains, so goods moving in and out of the UK and into the UK and back out into the EU again. So being able to maintain some form of customs arrangement, is absolutely key for those industries, at least in the short term, as we go through to agree the deal. From a people perspective, it's agriculture, retail and consumer markets, and hospitality and leisure. So if anybody's been to London and got into a Costa Coffee or a Starbucks, chances are you're being served by some young European that's over here working for free. How do they get into the UK going forward? Who's going to change the beds in the hotels? Who's going to make the latte for you? From a retail and consumer markets perspective, an agricultural perspective, the temporary workers that come in to pick I'm going to pick strawberries, although we've not got a great strawberry industry. Who's going to do that? How are they going to get those people in going forward? And then finally, from a regulatory perspective, financial services, life sciences are the most hit because they simply won't be able to do business going forward. Chemicals is one of my clients is a big chemicals producer, and at the moment we have a regulation called REACH within Europe that allows them to sell chemicals within Europe that are manufactured in the UK. How do they do that going forward is a challenge. So they're looking at changing their supply chain, making the legal manufacturer a different entity. And all of these have a tax impact. So when you start to look at, well, do I move part of my business from the UK to Dublin? Do I move manufacturing of my medicines from the UK to, the Netherlands as an example? We need to consider from a UK perspective, what is that? Have we got value moving from the UK out of the UK tax net into the EU? Does that give you an upfront tax charge in the UK? How do you manage that, and how do you get relief for that cost, in the member state that you're going to? So, companies that have moved have been, trying to carefully manage that process to put enough substance in those territories to meet the regulatory requirement, but while balancing the tax costs associated with that. So we've forgotten Hawaii, and Alaska, actually, from this map. So, 48 states. So thinking about your supply chain, so if you currently ship directly from if you feed the UK markets or the European markets, directly from the US, then things should continue, as they are. If you're selling directly into a UK customer from here, or you're selling directly into a French customer or a German customer from here, expectation is that wouldn't change, at least in the short term. Whereas if you're using the UK as your hub, or you're using Europe as your hub for supplying the UK, then you need to think about what is the impact on your supply chain. So this is a real issue for Japanese manufacturers, probably more than US manufacturers. So a lot of Japanese industry was, I guess, invited to the UK in the 80s by Margaret Thatcher, with the kind of the promise that we'd always stay within the EU. We've negotiated a great deal in terms of our budget rebates, et cetera, et cetera. A number of carve-outs from working time directives, and now we've gone and left. So the Japanese, in particular, are quite annoyed by what we've done, and that we've seen that come through. It may or may not be directly related to Brexit, but by cutting manufacturing in the UK in terms of Honda, Nissan no longer looking to produce a new car in the UK, the Qashqai is no longer going to be sold within Europe. So a number of issues coming to the fore. So if your UK company is central to your supply chain, you need to think carefully about, well, what does a no-deal Brexit mean? It will be very bad, I would have thought. But equally, what does the future look like? And do I need to change the way my supply chain works to minimise, perhaps not duties if we end up in a customs union with the European Union, but particularly in terms of transport and logistics? What does it do to my supply chain and my working capital requirements? So, I've talked to some of this. So, it doesn't affect all sectors equally. So you need to think carefully about what your business is. So those rooted businesses, and these are, as Charles mentioned, the research that the RAND Corporation's done. These are businesses that are in the UK that supply the UK domestic market. They have to be in the UK because that's where their customers are. So whether it's social care, UK transport, UK domestic retailers, and hotels, etc., that rely on the UK industry, well, there's probably not a great deal they can do about it. Their customers are still going to be in the UK. They're still going to need to be there. So it's how do you manage some of the probably the people aspects of us coming out of the EU the most for those businesses. The interconnected businesses, they have a large domestic footprint, but they're part of an integrated supply chain. So again, what do they need to do? Can they leave everything the same? Will there be a cost or an issue for them? Or do they need to start moving things into the EU to protect themselves in the event of a no-deal Brexit? And, interestingly, I don't know if any of you have had, letters from customers. So particularly in the auto industry, we've seen this. So the big auto manufacturers writing to their suppliers saying, what's your Brexit readiness plan? If you turn around and say, well, I haven't got one, that's likely to be problematic for you. So thinking about, well, what is my Brexit readiness plan? what's the impact on my suppliers of a no-deal Brexit, not just my position, and looking backwards through your supply chain to say, well, we know that it's potential duty impact, it's a potential logistics time impact on us, and there's an element of people as well, because we rely on either EU nationals within our factories, or we've got key people within our UK organisation that are EU nationals that we want to protect. And then finally, the mobile businesses. So we've not heard a great deal about this today, but the UK is a great place to do business. It doesn't sound like it at the moment, but we do have, one of the lowest tax rates within the G20. Helpfully, we speak English. Some of us not very well, but we do speak English. And then London, is a place that people want to live. It is a place that draws in people from across the world. It's a very international city. So, a number of my clients where we've done, restructurings with them where they've been told, you have to move to Switzerland or you have to move to Luxembourg. Nobody really wants to live in Luxembourg. Maybe, unless you're from Luxembourg, then it's lovely. And equally Switzerland, it's a lifestyle choice, but it doesn't fit for everybody. Whereas London, there's things going on, there's lots of international schools. It's a place that people want to do business, and that's the reason they're there. But they don't need to be there. So if you're a business in gaming, entertainment, etc., that doesn't need to be in London, well, where do you need to be to make sure you can still attract that talent? Is London still the right answer? And that really depends on where we end up with on immigration. So what actions are businesses taking in that context? So they are mapping the supply chain, so looking at where my potential costs are, can I mitigate or manage those? Do I change to domestic suppliers? What's the cost of doing that? Understanding the tax and tariff exposure. So KPMG has developed a tool that looks at imports and exports within your UK business and can tell you what the potential tax and tariff implications of a no-deal Brexit, and that will develop as we get to a deal as well. So you can understand, well, do I need to change and how would I mitigate that cost? Supplier and customer contracts. This is more of a legal issue, but is driven off, partly driven off the tax. So if you have tax and tariff costs arising as a result of Brexit, what do your contracts with customers say? Whose cost is that? And if your supplier's got a tax cost that they try to pass on to you, is that a cost to you within your contract or not? I advise on a number of contracts with clients where they're transacting cross-border, and they'll include gross-up clauses, which will essentially say that if you need to pay me £1,000 for this product, I expect £1,000. If there's a new withholding tax cost, or if there's some kind of indirect tax cost or a duty cost as a result of us leaving the EU, I still expect you to pay me £1,000, and you have to bear that cost. So how do you manage that within your contracts? The pre-existing contracts and contracts going forward. Corporate and entity structure. So this is an issue where you have UK might be the holding company for Europe, and you have Germany under the UK, Italy under the UK. If we leave the EU with no deal, then we fall outside of the EU directives for withholding tax on dividend payments up or on interest payments between those parties. So can you restructure out of that early? That's difficult to do, but it is a possibility to look at. So how does your corporate structure work, and is it impacted by Brexit? And then finally, people impact and engagement. So how do you keep your people happy? How do you show them that they're loved? I mean, we've got, I think, 900 EU nationals in our UK firm, so we've been engaging with them on an individual and collective basis to try and help them through the mess that's coming out of the government. And then obviously there's a number of other things on there, but they are probably longer term issues depending on where we get to with negotiations. So this is what we're saying to clients. So triage your Brexit decisions based on a potential no deal scenario. I think you should still be prepared for that. Our view as a firm is that that's probably going to happen by accident rather than by design. So this brinkmanship, I think an extension of the exit to the 31st of October does not guarantee a deal next month. I think if anything from our perspective, it probably will lengthen the time it will take towards the end of October. I know we've got the European elections in the middle, but if you are somebody who voted against Theresa May's deal for the first 3 times, well, you've got until October now to get something that you want. Why would you vote? There's no pressure really on you as a parliamentarian to vote for that deal. So what are the no regret things? So, the positive, the things that were kind of on the to-do list anyway, in terms of your business, why not do them if they give you protection from a no-deal Brexit? Tactical, so what are some useful mitigation for scenarios that may provide a tactical competitive advantage? So this is if you're written to by, the automotive manufacturer, the car manufacturer saying, what's your Brexit readiness plan? If you're the business that has one of those and your competitors don't, then that would give you a competitive advantage. The irreversible and the run risk are things that you're probably not going to do until the last minute, until you know you've actually got to do them, because there is a cost to doing that. And then running the risk is kind of self-insuring that risk. So we know there's a cost, we've identified the cost, but the cost of mitigating that is too high. So, we're going to run the risk of a no-deal Brexit. This is a busy slide, so hopefully you'll get it afterwards, but it kind of goes through some of the key questions you might ask yourself when you're going through that assessment process. So, from a market perspective, what will this mean for your markets going forward? Will EU-UK trade reduce? From your organisational governance structure, what will change? Operational technology and people and culture are the key ones on there. But these are some of the questions that boards should be asking themselves. We've seen some clients that are just, we're not doing anything at all. Our advice is that shouldn't be where you're at, because you don't want to get a question from your shareholders, from your investors, around, well, what is your Brexit readiness plan? What is the impact on your business? If you're doing M&A, you're looking at UK acquisitions, or you're looking at European acquisitions, what's the Brexit impact on that business, on that supply chain? You should be looking at that and considering it. This is a risk that should be on your risk register. It should have probably, I would say, a low risk, maybe medium risk of a catastrophic exit, and that would have a high impact. You just manage it like every other risk, but you need to understand, well, what is the impact on your business? That's it? Well, say that's it. It'll carry on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that excellent practical advice.